call the meeting of the Falmouth Historical Commission to order. This is a special meeting tonight where we have a special presentation. Now, just so the audience is aware, this is going to be a presentation of from the Cape Cod Commission of a Woods Hole Historic District Planning Study. Tonight is purely a presentation to the board. That means we will not be asking for public input tonight. We have another meeting scheduled for November 9th in the Herman Room of the library for that purpose, for the public to have input into the plan. So this is really our first look at it, but you will get a chance, if you're interested, to participate and put your views into the Cape Cod mission. That's November 9th at 5:30. Okay, I just want to give you a little bit of the background, the scope of the scope of work that we gave to the Cape Cod Commission and asked them to do for us. There was 4 major elements that we were looking for, and then I'm going to ask Nicole to give you a little bit of background of what brought this about, the Historical Commission commissioning or asking for the help of the Cape Cod Commission, what that means, and why we did it, because really Nicole was the impetus in bringing it to our attention. So the four main elements that we asked for is to evaluate existing historic district boundary and regulations consistent with Chapter 40C Historic District Act requirements, recommend ways to address potential conflicts between current zoning regulations and historic preservation goals, suggest improvements to bicycle and pedestrian facilities in the village, and illustrate ways to preserve and enhance significant view sheds and community character elements. So if you, Nicole, just give them a little background as to why this was something we were interested in, just so they understand.
So it was about maybe a year ago or so that I identified or started seeing a pattern in what I refer to sort of as the gateway to Woods Hole, which happens to be contain the historic district in Woods Hole. We saw a significant amount of properties that were undergoing huge transformations, including things starting sort of up at the top, like Winding Lane, what was Sleepy Hollow Motel, now the Treehouse, the Nautilus property, the Church of the Messiah, the Coast Guard station, the Steamship Authority, docks, and Hui, which is going to be going through a major transformation of their dock in Great Harbor, and also then it's going to have effects on their Quissit campus, as well as then coming back the Woods Hole Historical Museum, which is also looking, and I could show you on a map more easily, but you'll see they're all clustered very closely in really the center of Woods Hole. And I started asking questions about smart growth and was anybody looking at how the community was developing, or were these all isolated pieces? And how were we then, with all these changes in the historic district, going to maintain our historic character? So one thing led to another, which led us to the Cape Cod Commission, which apparently was the right body of people to connect with, who could help us because they provide services to our towns in order to assist us in these planning processes. And we identified it as a historical commission project in cooperation with the planning board because of the historic district, designation.
Yeah.
And we look at this also, we started with Woods Hole because it's very complex and there were all these changes. We hope that this is a good template to bring to the other historic districts to help us work out many of the same issues. You did mention pedestrian and bicycle access and view sheds, and I'm sure Sarah and Chloe will talk about that. Very significantly, we have issues with traffic, and so hopefully some of these things have to do with traffic calming as well.
So with that, just so you get a little background as to what brought us to this point tonight, I'll turn it over to Sarah and Chloe and see what they have to say.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Sarah Korjeff. I'm the Preservation Specialist with the Cape Cod Commission, and I'm here with my colleague Chloe Shafer, who's the Community Design Planner. We are going to give you a little presentation on what we've done so far in this Woods Hole planning study, and there'll be a little bit of repetitiveness because some of the introduction you just got from the Historical Commission members, we've covered a little bit in our presentation here. But for the most part, we're interested in walking you through what we've done so far in terms of identifying existing conditions, beginning analysis, and then moving on to talking about the next steps and where we go from here. So go ahead and advance one. So an overview of the study area and sort of the main things we were trying to accomplish. You've already heard from the board members. We do have a memorandum of agreement with the town of Falmouth that spells out exactly what issues they want us to cover and what particular products we're to return to them. So right now we're in the middle of we finished up the existing conditions analysis. We've looked very carefully at the historic district and the area around it, and then we'll get on to the next steps. So here's our study area. This is an aerial view of Woods Hole. The solid line shows the boundary of the study area, and the dotted line shows the boundary of the existing historic district in Woods Hole. And you'll see that the existing historic district is almost fully contained within the study area boundary. We didn't go quite far enough to the southeast to catch it all the way down to Knobska Light, but it does include all the areas where there's been some change noticed, as Nicole Goldman mentioned in the introduction. Go ahead, Chloe. So 3 areas of focus, really, as we walk through this presentation. We're going to talk about zoning in the town, community character in the village, I should say, and how those 2 things interplay, how zoning can actually guide community character or cause changes. We're going to talk about pedestrian and bicycle accommodations in the village, and we're going to talk about historic preservation, both historic resources and regulations that are there now. So our memorandum of agreement lays out 4 tasks for us to do. The first is background research, looking at existing studies that have been done already for the area. There were in the past a few historic preservation plans that were done, some that really looked at the entire town but had a component focusing on Woods Hole, and also looking at existing zoning, historic district regulations, existing facilities. Those are task 1 and 2, and that's what we'll talk about today. Task 3 gets into gathering public input and really trying to make sure that we understand all of the issues of concern to folks in Woods Hole and in the town and in the Historical Commission and the Planning Board. And as Mr. Haddad mentioned, there's a workshop coming up in about 2 weeks which will be our main opportunity to gather public information. But in addition to that, you're always welcome to provide input by contacting the Historical Commission members or the town planner or either Chloe or myself. And task 4 is the final report, essentially putting together recommendations for the town to move forward with. We like to start off with a series of aerial photographs of Woods Hole that help to illustrate some ways that it's changed over time. And these are, I understand at this scale it's a little bit hard to see, but these are just 3 photos. The one on the far left, 1952. You can just barely see the study area, I think, outlined in a black line there. And then the one in the center is an aerial photograph from 1971, and on the right, in color, an aerial photograph from 2002. And in our report, or actually, at the workshop, you'll have an opportunity to look at these even closer. But we wanted to highlight some of the obvious changes in the village over this time period. And I think really the easiest one to see when you look up close, we've highlighted in the small rectangular box at the bottom there, is the change from on the property that was originally the railroad. The end point of the railroad, but now has, once the railroad was abandoned, that property turned over into the Steamship Authority's hands and became a major parking lot and ferry terminal to the islands. But in 1952, it still operated as a railroad, And you can still see the tracks in that photograph when you look at it up close, and you can see all the different buildings that were associated with the railroad use and sort of how that's changed from 1971 and 2002. There's a couple of other things that really stand out, I think, in the series of aerial photographs. One is the additional residential development that happens, for example, on along Woods Hole Road on the north side. In the 1952 photograph, there really is not a lot of residential development, but in the 1971 and 2002 photographs, you can see the development of residential neighborhoods on the north side there, sort of just south of the large golf course. And you can also see some changes around Eel Pond, particularly where we start off with small residential scale buildings all around, I should say, the north, east, and west sides of Eel Pond. But over time, with the development of the research laboratories there, we begin to see some of those smaller scale buildings replaced by much larger scale laboratories. Okay. So first, walking you through, we've put together a series of maps that illustrate the existing conditions, and the first one is existing land use. So this map, and I should say that in all the maps that we show you, you'll see the study area shown in a solid white line, and you'll see the historic district boundaries in the dotted white line. This map shows the existing land uses, so what's on the ground today in terms of uses. The dark red shows commercial uses. You can note that right in the core, sort of the downtown area where the post office is, you can see that's the dark red area. There's a couple of other red spots that identify existing hotels. And then there's one property actually that's on Challenger Drive that's zoned commercial, or that's identified as commercial, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. So that's one thing that we're hoping folks can help us look into there. But go ahead. Oh, actually, step back one more time. So, and so the yellow zones are existing residential uses. One of the things that really makes Woods Hole unique is the amount of government and educational uses that are in the village. And so you can see everything shown is in blue is educational. That's covering largely the MBL and the Woods Hole oceanographic properties. And then in the pink, government properties, and that's everything, or government and exempt properties. So that includes the churches, it includes the bike trail, the Steamship Authority property, it includes the Coast Guard property, and a few others too. But this is a little bit unusual in terms of the volume of that type of use in the village. Okay. Now, a different way of looking at what's on the ground today is to look at what the zoning regulations in the town are. And here in Woods Hole Village, there are two districts that relate to commercial uses. First is Business 1, and that covers the area around the post office, sort of the tightly developed downtown area. You can see that the Steamship Authority parcel is also zoned Business 1. And also, and I should be using my little clicker, I see. And also, so that's the area I'm talking about is right here, zoned business. But then there's also the business redevelopment zone, which is this parcel here. This is the parcel that has the Woods Hole Dome on it. And then in addition, we have large public use zones in the town of Falmouth. For example, this area, this is the Challenger Drive area, mostly Woods Hole oceanographic property. Also, I'm having trouble with my dot here. This is the Coast Guard area, and then over here we have a lot of the MBL and Hui properties also. And then one last comment about zoning. There are actually 5 different residential zones in the study area here. And they vary a little bit in terms of the minimum lot size and the setback requirements and things like, and the amount of coverage. But you can see there's a general residence district right here in the center. This is essentially across the street from the post office. There's a single residence A district. I'm going to have trouble with the colors, so maybe it's not, yeah, that's the one that's up here. Is that right? The colors broadcast on the screen a little differently than they are. But I think it's suffice to say that there are several different districts. They all have slightly different regulations, and so that's one of the things we'll be looking at more closely. So in comparing the land use, so the existing land use on the ground with what the zoning allows, there's a few things that come to our attention. First here, looking at the Steamship Authority parcel. So here we've got a large government use, but you can see under zoning, it's zoned Business 1. There's other properties too. This is actually owned by, I believe, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Am I right? Here's a property that's educational use, so it's actually zoned business. And then if we look at the lower part of the Steamship Authority parcel here, the more southerly section, it's actually zoned residential right there. So just there's a number of places where there's a difference between what's on the ground and what zoning would allow. And that's just, it's something that raises a little flag because it could affect what could happen in the future. I also want to write notice on this other inset. Here, this is the Woods Hole Dome property. So currently, it's it's shown as residential use, and on either side of it, it's shown as commercial use. These are both hotels. But over here in what the zoning shows, this is shows the Dome property as the business redevelopment district, and then on either side, those hotels are both in residential zones. So looking at yet another example under ownership. Again, this kind of highlights an issue that I mentioned early on, that there's an awful lot of government and research institution ownership in the Woods Hole area. You can see everything shown in purple is owned by Woods Hole Oceanographic. So we're talking about this whole area as well as a group of properties on the south side of Woods Hole Road. Marine Biological Laboratories owns a lot of the properties to the west of Eel Pond. We've got the Steamship Authority here. We've got the town of Falmouth owning the rail bed, now the bike trail and parking area, and then Coast Guard, and then of course down here is Nobska Light. Looking at open space, this is one thing that we usually look at as a way of trying to identify some of the key characteristics and sort of desirable features of a village. Here, there's not a lot of permanently protected open space in Woods Hole, but of course the rail bed here, the bike trail, is permanently protected. Other areas what people might think of as open space, like the golf course here, of course, has no permanent protection. There is a parcel on School Street here that has limited protection. And just pointing out also the park here on the south side of Water Street doesn't have any kind of permanent protection. But those are places, of course, that people recognize as significant defining features in the village. Another issue that we can't forget about is, and sort of looking to the future, is the issue of flood zones. So Woods Hole, of course, being right here on the water, this is a significant issue. The two types of flood zones that we typically look at are V zones, which are velocity zones. So that's where you actually get forward movement of the water that can be more damaging, versus an A zone where there would be a rise of water but not expected to be as much destructive force behind it. So here, the V zone follows the coastline for the most part. I believe we found that it doesn't seem to touch any buildings within the district. But the A zone, of course, does. And in particular, you'll see that there's a very large area around Eel Pond, north, west, south, and even a little bit to the east that would be affected by the A zone. And actually, in some of our conversations with residents there, including older residents who'd lived there for a long time, we heard stories about the consistent flooding routine flooding of this area and actually having to be relocated to other quarters for short periods of time while they waited for the floodwaters to recede. Go ahead. So now the meat of my portion of the project really is looking at the historic properties in the village. This is the Candle House right on Water Street, one of the most distinctive buildings. And just to note that it is probably one of the most distinctive and older buildings in the district, but I'm sorry, in the village, but it is not protected in any way. It's not in the historic district. So go ahead, Chloe, for the next slide. So trying to illustrate the fact that Woods Hole has a historic district. Here, this map shows in yellow and orange all of the historic properties that have been inventoried, which means they have a form that's been completed that spells out sort of their general history and their architectural significance, and it's on file with the Massachusetts Historical Commission in what's called the MACRIS database. So all of these colored properties within the boundaries of the district have had an inventory form completed for them. Most of them have had an individual inventory form, which means that that specific building has been studied and its information has been documented on the form. Some have actually been done as groups, though, and that's called an area form. And the area forms, while they do give us some good information, don't have as much detail about each individual structure. So that's why we've called them out in two separate colors. But I think what's really the most dramatic thing is to go to the next slide and see all of these red buildings are buildings with historic significance that have been inventoried on file with Mass Historical Commission, but are not in the historic district. They're outside of the boundaries. So you can see that all along the north side of Eel Pond and to the northeast, all the way, everything on the west side and the south side of Eel Pond, there are lots of properties shown in two colors of red here that are not protected in any way, but have been identified as historically significant. There are also a lot of other properties that sort of sprinkled throughout here on Juniper Point, some further back along Church Street on both sides, and then on the south side of Woods Hole Road, and then a few up here up Challenger Drive too, set much further back from the main roadway. So again, as I explained, there were two colors used for within the historic district. The two different colors of red for properties outside the historic district do the same thing, showing what buildings have an individual inventory form versus what buildings have an area historical form. Now, we wanted to look at the age of the historic properties in the district and in the study area as one measure of determining where the buildings with the greatest significance or uniqueness are, because we're always interested in, when we're losing our historic properties, we get a smaller and smaller number of the older properties from the 18th century and the early 1800s. So that's one way of paying attention to where those are located. So here, and this is, we have two different ways of looking at the age of the properties within the study area. And this map here shows looking at the MACRIS database, so the Mass Historical Commission's database. And the buildings are colored. Oh, yeah, and the second, if you go ahead. So, and then we have a second way of looking at the age of buildings, which is using the assessor's database. But if we step back to the MACRIS one, here the colors are toned so that the oldest buildings are shown in the darkest color red. That covers the 1700s. The 1800s are covered in sort of oranges. And then when we get into the 20th century, we've got the yellow, green, and blue. And then the gray toned out buildings are the most recent structures. But so just looking at here, we can see the oldest clusters of buildings are sort of along the north side of Woods Hole Road and Water Street in this area. And then they're sort of sprinkled throughout in other parts of the study area too. So with MACRIS data, we have very good information about the age of these historic buildings, but we don't have MACRIS data for every single building that's in the village. And so that's where the assessor's data comes into play, because the assessor's database does have a date or a year built category for every building in the town, and certainly in Woods Hole Village. The problem is that the assessor's database was not set up to be a historical record, and so the dates that are included in the assessor's database are sometimes not accurate. And if we go to the next slide, we'll show you just a couple of examples. Remember, we looked at the Candle House at the beginning of this section. That's what's shown right here on the north side of Water Street. Looking at the Macris database, it's shown in red, which is accurate. It's dark orange. It was built circa 1820, 1830. But if you look at the same building in the assessor's database, it dates it as blue, 1950 to 1975. So that kind of thing, unfortunately, happens frequently in assessors, and not just in Falmouth. We see this everywhere. Here's another example. This is sometimes called the Challenger House, right on Challenger Drive. Also the, Swift, Parker, Fay House. You can see in the Macris database, it's from the late 1700s. But if we look at it here in the assessor's database, it puts it in the early 1900s. So I think one of the problems is that whenever we have a building that has later additions, a lot of times the assessors end up dating the building to the time of that later addition, or if there's a major renovation, the date built gets revised. So that's something that we have to pay attention to. The assessor's database, we're glad when it can help us fill in holes that we don't have from the Macris data, but we always have to be careful about the assumptions we make when we use that their year-built information. Okay, looking back at the historic district, one of the things about Falmouth's historic districts, which are a little bit unusual on Cape Cod, is that they are defined not with property boundaries, but actually as a certain distance set back from the roadways in the district. So for example, when we look down Church Street here, the boundary of the district is 200 feet back from either side of Church Street. And the same with most of the other streets in here. And what that does is it means that the historic district boundary is cutting through a lot of property lines. And this graphic is meant to show just how many lots are split by the district. So anything shown in this darker red color actually is split by the historic district, whereas the purpley color are lots that are completely contained within the district. So you can see a lot of these smaller lots that face on Water Street and Woods Hole Road, and some of the smaller ones in these little streets that are on Juniper Point. My little dot is, there we go. Those are all fully contained within the district, but there's an awful lot that are not. And while I'm on this slide, I just want to point out one other thing. When Falmouth's historic districts were created, it was by a special act of the legislature in 1975, and Woods Hole's district at that time was only the north side of Woods Hole Road from, what's this street here? From Harbor Hill Road to School Street. So in 1975, when the district was created, it was 200 feet deep just along the north side of that road. In the 1980s, it was expanded to what you see today. So they included both sides of Church Street all the way down to the town-owned property down by Nobska. And all of these little roads here on Juniper Point, it extended up School Street as far as Millfield, and it extended down Water Street to the drawbridge and sort of around, is this Railroad Ave? Okay. So there was one period of expansion of the district, but it didn't solve the problem of splitting the lots in two. So that's one issue that really needs to be looked at a little more carefully. And next slide. And now I will turn it over to Chloe Shafer to continue. You ready?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the pedestrian and bicyclist facilities in the area. If you want to go ahead, Sarah. So we first took stock of the pedestrian facilities here, looking at the sidewalk network as well as the crosswalks, and we categorized them according to the condition of the sidewalks. So the darkest red ones which are primarily located down here along Water Street and in the core commercial area. Were good sidewalks. They were wide. They seemed well maintained, fair condition. This kind of medium pink, which goes along Woods Hole Road up here, and down here a little bit. And then sidewalks where they did exist, but they were in poor condition, so maybe they were overgrown, maybe they were bumpy, they needed more maintenance down here, and kind of as you move farther out from this downtown core area here. There's also a lot of crosswalks here and here connecting areas, but there is a noticeable lack of crosswalks along Woods Hole Road to get you from the north side to the south side. And then next was the Bicyclist Facilities. So, of course, you have the great bike path here, the Cheyenne Sea Bike Path, and designated off-street, for the most part, bicyclist route. But then along Church Street here, and for a little bit along Woods Hole Road and up School Street is a designated on-street bike route. There aren't necessarily designated facilities on the streets for those, but they're signed as bike routes. So the main access to the bike path, struggling with this, is down at the Steamship Authority here. That's where you can get on and go under the bridge and along onto the path. We did notice, and it's also identified in the town's bike plan, that there could be some improved signage guiding people onto the path here. Because we also noticed that on Church Street right here, there's kind of this informal bike path access, which is this photo here, where people have made their way up through the grass, through the bushes, or down from Church Street onto the bike path.
Well, could you just go back for
Sure.
one second? I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This informal bike paths. You said-
Access.
Oh, sorry. Not informal.
Yep.
Where there was a bike path, but it's not marked on the street. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so there's a designated bike route, and there are some signs. I know I saw a sign up along School Street showing bike route. So I don't know if you've seen them in communities, but they're usually kind of small green signs. So it's just directing people, I think, to roads that maybe are quieter, but there's not necessarily like a bike lane on those roads. And then next was this kind of broader area of community character. So, go ahead, yeah. We started to kind of characterize the study area into 6 different groups. And so starting from the east, this purple area was really kind of where you start to feel like you're entering the village here. The vegetation starts to pull back a little, and you can see signs of the buildings along Woods Hole Road. This yellow area right here along Woods Hole Road, buildings are coming more to the street. There are some larger buildings, such as the motels there on the north side, and then on the south side, you have this vegetation and this vista out to the sound. Next is this core commercial area, which is really densely, tightly developed. The street's a little narrower. There's a lot of pedestrian activity, sidewalks on both sides of the road. And then moving up School Street, you have some more kind of moderate residential development, some of which down towards the south is used for institutional or other purposes, and moving more into residential uses to the north. And then this area back north of Eel Pond, which is more of a quiet and small-scale residential developed area, still used primarily for residential purposes. And then lastly is this kind of northwest corner, which is really dominated by the larger institutional buildings. And then the other really defining aspect of this area is these great vistas that you all have. So first, again, starting from the east, we have this one along Woods Hole Road here, where you're up higher, looking out over the sound. Another one is on Crane Street, looking out over the Steamship Authority. And again, these 2 vistas, you both, you have a sense of being up higher, that elevation, and getting kind of the broader perspective there. Next was along Eel Pond, so looking more to the northwest from School Street. You can see all the boats. You're seeing some of the institutional buildings here, but that's across the water. And then from the other side of Eel Pond here as well, there's a little kind of landing area where you can take in the view the other way. And then there's also, of course, this vista from the bridge here right in the commercial core, looking out into the ocean, and then further up Water Street, of course, the waterfront park, which provides these nice open views of the Sound. And so, you can go ahead, Sarah. There are all of these really great vantage points that have beautiful views in the area, but one thing we took away is it's really only at the waterfront park where you can sit down and enjoy this view. There aren't really many benches or amenities at any of these other areas, but they're definitely something that should be enjoyed or could be enjoyed. So our next steps for this, as was mentioned, is the November 9th workshop, and for that we are planning on kind of going through a similar presentation to highlight some of these issues and opportunities in the areas, such as a mismatch between what zoning would provide and existing land use or existing built environment character, all of the historic buildings that lack protection outside of the district, and maybe how to take better advantage of the view sheds in the area. And that presentation would be followed by an interactive map exercise to gain public comments and ideas and feedback. So with that, I think we'll take any questions.
Yeah, so we were hoping that, we'd be happy to answer questions, and also, I think one of the questions we have for you all is, are there issues that we've covered that you'd like us to go into a little more depth on, or are there anything that we're missing that you want us to make sure that we cover at the workshop? Because as Chloe said, what we anticipate giving a presentation like this to give everyone sort of the basic ground, put everyone on the same page in terms of knowledge about existing conditions, but then to break out into different groups where we'll have a staff facilitator at each table, and each table would have a particular topic that we would discuss for a period of time. We would have maps that we would have people have certain exercises where we're going to be asking folks to either mark things on a map or to produce comments on the map so that we can take all that information and really get a better understanding of where people's ideas all gel sort of as a focus in one area or another, as opposed to things that only might be on the periphery of their interests, but really be able to identify what the highlights are, what people are most concerned about.
Just first, although I said no public commentary, if anybody has a question about clarification, not input into the project, it's just a clarification, they didn't understand something, I'd like to, give you the opportunity to clarify that for that purpose. So if there's any public questions about, from that perspective, a clarification, a question about something that you just saw, not input into the project, any questions that somebody might have from the presentation?
What are the implications of being inside or outside the historic district as it is presently defined?
I'm just going to talk about that too, so I will answer that question, because that's going to be one of my questions. So thank you for segueing right into that. One of the things that certainly the Historical Commission was concerned about, and why we were most interested in this project, obviously it's a historic district. It's probably the one village of the historic districts that probably has the most unique character, because it's a tight community, close buildings, a lot of historic buildings into it. So I think the one thing that I would be most concerned about, and making sure that people understand, is, there's an issue of the ages of homes. There's a lot of historic homes that are not in the district. And for just to that question, what does that mean? And I think people need to understand, people who, let's say, buy a historic home or buy in Woods Hole because they think it's this protected village, because it has remained uniquely contained for a long period of time, as opposed to, we see a lot of changes in the other historic districts. This one has resisted change, especially in the residential areas, but that's not protected. And I think we need to talk about that, and people need to understand what they could be exposed to when they think they're in this unique place, that suddenly could change overnight. So I think,
My apologies for scrolling through this so quickly, but, all right. Yeah, I think this graphic highlights it the best. Dad, do you want me to talk about
Yeah.
sort of the implications between?
Yeah.
So obviously, if you're within the boundaries of the historic district here, as within all the other historic districts in the town of Falmouth, anytime you're proposing to make a change to the exterior of your building that's visible from a public way, you have to get a permit, not just from the town building department, but also from the Historic District Commission, or the Historical Commission, as they go by now. So they have essentially review authority over exterior changes to to buildings as viewed from a public way, and that's a standard procedure for historic districts in the state of Massachusetts. Falmouth's historic districts didn't used to be the typical Massachusetts historic district, but about, a year and a half ago,
Yeah, 2 years.
they adopted legislation that made their prior historic districts now consistent with the state's general bylaw or general laws that establish historic districts. So in that way, they're consistent with almost all the other historic districts on Cape Cod and most of the ones in Massachusetts. So here, looking at the number of historic properties that are outside of the historic district, obviously there's some concern about the potential to lose those buildings because there's nothing to prevent them from being demolished, no regulation to prevent them from being demolished. And at the same time, there's concern about the possibility of real big changes in the character of the village if those buildings were lost one at a time. I think sometimes it's easy for people to say, well, it's just one building that we're losing. But the fact is, if you lose one building every 5 years, then it doesn't take very long for that to really add up. And especially if they're in close quarters to each other, you can really start to see a dramatic difference in the character of an area, of a streetscape, or of a village. So there's a lot of concern about the clusters of historic properties here that really define Woods Hole Village that don't have any permanent form of protection. So one of the things we need to look at is how big a concern that is for folks. Are there particular areas that you're most concerned about protecting, or are there particular buildings that you're most concerned about protecting? I think the Candle House is a really good example of one that it might be worth going to the greatest effort to try to make sure that it's protected in the long term, because it's very unique. It's one of the older buildings in the district. It's got an incredibly prominent location right on Water Street, and it's very identifiable. I mean, people really think of Woods Hole when they see that building. So, but it's not the only one. So looking at all of those buildings, one of the things we'll have in time for the workshop is an assessment of each of the historic buildings within the study area and sort of giving a grade to them based on their historical and architectural significance, and also based on the level to which they contribute to the streetscape. So that'll be a way for folks to take a look and say, these are the buildings that matter the most to us, these are the areas that matter the most to us to try to protect. And then from there, we can take the next step of talking about the range of opportunities for protection. Because there's everything from expanding the boundaries of your existing historic district there's actually a very specific process that you have to go through to do that, including public meetings, approval by Mass Historical Commission. Or there are some other alternatives too. There's the potential to create single property historic districts. If you have very significant individual properties, you can actually, in Massachusetts, you can establish historic districts around a single property. There's also the potential to look at providing some additional protection through zoning, an overlay district that actually creates incentives for reuse of historic buildings. So it's a disincentive to the property owners to actually consider demolition. So there's a variety of options that could be considered. But I think that this will be, given that this is being largely directed by the Historical Commission, this will really be one of our key issues.
thank you.
I wanted to just add, you bring up the pedestrian and the bike access, and you show that. I think one of the issues that I think may come up, certainly at the community workshop, is how that, and the crosswalks, how it's all impacting traffic. One of the biggest issues within the historic district and within the village. I know it is a larger scope, but hoping that there are recommendations that we can implement that may affect or calm the traffic, as I mentioned before.
So one of the people on our staff, Cape Cod Commission staff team that didn't come with us this evening is Lev Malikoff, who's one of our transportation engineers, and he was on the site visit earlier in the summertime. And his focus really has been on pedestrian and bicycle issues because that's what's defined in the scope. But to the extent that we can get him to talk a little bit about traffic calming, because that really helps bicycle and pedestrian, really that's the purpose of it, then that's certainly something that we could, would be one of the topics at the workshop.
I was just going to say one of the areas that I think would be helpful is understanding what the architectural vernacular is of Woods Hole, for lack of a better term, because this board is really, we're chartered with enforcing a set of guidelines, and we look at a lot of designs, and there's stone buildings, there's shingle style buildings, there's a whole array of architectural forms down there, and so understanding kind of what is the guiding form, or what are some of the important architectural features of the buildings that are important, so that we can relate to those as we're making decisions on new projects. I think we have these guidelines we're supposed to be enforcing, and we have design. We look at designs, but it's really, if you look at some of the buildings down there, you have such a wide variety of architectural styles. It would be nice to know kind of sort of what are some of the common features, or what are some of the important aspects of the historic buildings that kind of help better inform this board when we do make our decisions.
Sure. And I think one thing you should always consider is referring back to the Macris inventory forms, to the extent that you have them, because those have an architectural description on each one, some better than others depending on sort of how long ago they were done. But that really spells out some of the key character defining features on some of the buildings, and it's a good way to sort of justify your decisions if you can refer back to those inventory forms as part of it. But to the extent that those forms don't cover all buildings in the district, I think we can talk about ways to help guide your decision making, in terms of identifying what are the most character defining features.
Or common themes of the buildings that make them, that help us to understand the way they, why they're, other than beyond the age, why there's, whether
Why
it's
they look the way they do.
Yeah, whether it's the gables, or the things that,
Yeah.
because we do deal with a lot of design, and I think there's understanding that in the context of the village is important.
Right. So does Falmouth have, as part of its design guidelines, does it have a section sort of walks through historic architecture in the town? Okay. But maybe not in enough detail to really get at all the issues in Woods Hole, so we could look at that.
Highlight it, yeah.
Yeah, but, in relation to your comment, that's one of the impetuses for taking this on, is that we don't want to look at each of these huge developments in isolation. We're trying to, how do we look at them as part of a continuum? So it relates to your design question. I mean, that's what's we're always charged with, and it's, if we had a plan or some kind of like overlay, as you describe, then we don't, each one isn't just its own separate piece. It's part of a whole.
Well, and that's part of what we were trying to get at when Chloe walked through the character areas, that for us on an initial couple of site visits, those were very distinctly different neighborhood feels that we found. And I think identifying what makes each of those areas unique, whether it's the building setback, the building size, the building style, some of those, defining that a little bit more clearly may be helpful to your board as you're reviewing changes in each of those areas.
Sarah, when we get to the public also, I don't want this to come across to the public like this is a historical commission perspective only, like we're only doing this to create a museum down there, that's not what we're trying to do. So do you talk about benefits to the public, whether it's quality of life, financial, businesses to businesses, whatever, tourism? I mean, do we talk about those things that could be sort of spring from this?
We could talk about that a little bit. I think all those ideas that you mentioned are all things that are pretty well recognized in reports that have been done all over the country. Not just in Massachusetts or on Cape Cod, but yeah, I think it's pretty easy for us to borrow from the Mass Historical Commission reports about the values of having a historic district and how it can help stabilize property values. It can do a better job of encouraging tourism and a variety of other issues too. So that's something that I don't think we would be creating ourselves. I think it's something that's been looked at by other folks, so we could just sort of bring that discussion in.
I think that would just help the public see a broader picture of the benefits here
Sure.
than just as a preserving historic district alone.
And I think, I went into great detail about the historic properties. I don't want to leave out the fact that we're looking much more carefully at the zoning districts too, and what zoning allows. And some of the questions that we want to ask people at the workshop are about, how do you feel about the scale of the existing commercial area? How do you feel about the potential for new development in the business redevelopment area where the dome is? And looking at some of the uses that zoning allows in those districts, are you comfortable with all of the uses that are allowed in those districts? For example, business redevelopment allows gas stations. So do you really want in Woods Hole to contemplate that on that single parcel that you've zoned business redevelopment, or should it be tweaked a little bit? And there are some considerations like that. In general, to be honest, we think that the underlying zoning is pretty good. And that's why your village probably has survived as well as it has for this long. But recognizing the sort of increased speed of change that you're seeing, it's important to take a closer look and identify things that we've maybe never thought could happen in the past, but now maybe you recognize that they might, and so it's worth tightening things up a little bit.
Questions? So how long, the next meeting, which is the public workshop, you're still, I guess, putting more information together and what you'll accumulate. So like I said, at that point, it'll be full public input. We'll have the opportunity to get a lot closer to this, I should say.
Yes. So what we found when we have, I think the most successful workshops we've held actually break people into smaller groups and allow them to have a real discussion with people rather than being in a big sort of lecture format. So we'll break into smaller tables, probably with one topic covered on each table, and people will be allowed to sort of circulate as they wish. If they are only interested in bicycle and pedestrian facilities, they can stay at that table the whole time. Or if they're interested in everything, they can circulate from one to another. And we'll have specific sort of questions and exercises designed to elicit feedback from people about what's most important to them and what issues they're concerned about. I think, really the issue that we're interested in hearing about most, and maybe even from you this evening, is, specific concerns you have, what you're afraid of that might happen. Like maybe you've seen something happen in other villages or other communities that you want to make sure that doesn't happen in Woods Hole. And because if we had a good understanding of what people are afraid of, it maybe would help us define what you could do to prevent that.
Well, just to that point, there is something going on in another village that is not a historic district, the tear downs and the building of the McMansions. We see that. I see that going on, and it changes the whole character.
Yeah.
of that area, you know. And yes, they're big, beautiful houses, but the character's completely different. It's not bad, it's not good, but it's different, you know.
Yeah, one of the things I think we've seen in some of the other villages, for instance, are where we have the split properties and they're able to maintain the buildings that are on the front of the property, but there's massive development on the back that also radically changes the character of the area. So that would be, sort of a great concern.
And this is waterfront property, clearly very valuable property. Like I said, I think it's unique that it's maintained itself to the extent that it has all this time for being such prime property, I'll call it, you know.
So I guess it's also the sort of the nature of the split properties. I mean, that's a concern all over town. It's very difficult to handle at this level.
I guess also for the public's benefit too, you know, you're gonna go through the workshops, accumulate a lot of information, a ton of information, I'm sure. And then how does this ultimately come back to the town? Is there a presentation that they all could also hear to? Is this to the selectmen? I mean, how does that work? Just so they're aware of what the process is.
We have after the workshop and an opportunity to sort of synthesize all the feedback we get, then we will develop draft recommendations, which will be presented to, I guess, the Board of Selectmen, I have to remember. But certainly with the Historical Commission's involvement, I think, and the public invited. And then based on feedback from boards and individuals, at that point, there'll be an opportunity to make some changes to the, if there are draft recommendations that people want to see altered slightly or removed because they're not comfortable with them, then that'll be the sort of the final step and lead to the final recommendations and report.
Okay.
One of the things I'm concerned about, once we get these final recommendations and are given steps to take, how we figure out how to actually implement them. What guidance can we get there?
Well, I think our recommendations will be divided sort of into categories. So there'll be certain things that would be in the sort of in the hands of the planning department and the planning board, probably if they relate to zoning. So they would have to, if they want to make a change to zoning, they have to go through the normal process that you would have of public hearings and ultimately bringing it to town meeting for a vote. And but if they're changes to the rules and regulations of the Historical Commission or changes to the boundaries, there are different processes. And we'll certainly spell that all out. As I mentioned, if you want to pursue changing the boundaries of the historic district, there is a specific process that's spelled out in Massachusetts general law to follow. So I think it should be pretty straightforward.
One of the issues I found very interesting was the initial historic district and the expansion of it. And I'm very curious about the process and the whole, decision-making to make that happen. And I don't know if you can go into a little more depth on the history of those changes, because that would be very helpful in anticipation of maybe furthering that discussion, as you walked around other neighborhoods that are potentially targetable. And I wasn't around during that process, and I'm sure it was pretty hot debate. So
yeah, well, what I can say now is that I haven't actually seen original documents from that. So what I've learned has been by speaking to people who've been residents here since the 80s. And I think the main message I got was that people were interested in, or they recognized that there was an awful lot of historic properties in the downtown core that were not included in the historic district that they wanted to make sure they provided some protection for, but that they had some difficulties in persuading the big research institutions that that they should put their properties in the district. And I think if you think back to the 1980s, I believe that that was prior to any of the big expansions that maybe in recent history have been done around Eel Pond. And so the question is, if we were to approach, it's not? Oh, okay. All right. Well, some of the larger buildings that are in place now have happened since 1985. Some of the ones on Water Street, I guess I'm thinking about. So what about the one on the northwest corner of Eel Pond?
That was the 60s.
That was the
They tore
60s.
down some very nice houses.
All right, so that was, okay, so somewhere early. But I think the main question, and thank you for helping me with the history there. I think the main question is through finding the best way to sit down with the research institutions and find out, how they feel about the historic buildings that are under their ownership and whether they would consider more favorably today being in the historic district or some other way of providing some protection for the historic buildings. I think there's no doubt that the research institutions are an incredibly important part of Woods Hole, and they have been great stewards for a lot of the historic buildings that are there. So, it's an important discussion to have, and it's never easy to expand or create a new historic district. There's always a lot of concerns that will arise, and I think the best tool we have is just good public information and open discussion.
Do you have a question? Ann?
I have sort of an answer. Jeff Whitney, who lived in Woods Hole, was chairman of but had been on the planning board for quite a while, and I think he was a prime mover in getting the historic districts in town. And perhaps, I don't know this for a fact, but particularly involved in Woods Hole, in the Woods Hole district.
Is he still active or no?
No longer with us.
Okay.
Okay, so one more comment and then we're going to close.
I just have a question on whether this presentation will be available either online or at Town Hall between now and November 9th for us to take a closer look at.
So I guess we can ask the folks who are broadcasting when it will be available.
You should check the FCTV website and it will be posted on there.
Okay.
The slides, I think, was the question.
Yeah, okay.
Specific maps, I think, is the most
Yeah, well, so
interest.
Corey, if we give you a copy of the presentation, can be put on the town website or?
Yeah, we can put it on the Historical Commission page.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, because there's a lot of information there.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I think we're going to wrap up. We're looking forward to the 9th.
Great.
Sharp pencils.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you all for
What time on the 9th?
5:30
And it will be at the library.
in the Herman Room. Yep. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful turnout.
We still have our regular meeting going on, so if you don't mind, if you're done, if you don't mind leaving, so we can just finish our business. Thank you. Just one discussion that we talked about, talking about the process of the boundaries, that we were going to do that as a special meeting.
Yeah, so I think as we go through this process, we should be careful that we don't present any of it as a fait accompli.
No.
That people are aware that that's not where we're headed necessarily. That wasn't the impetus for what we're doing, but that whatever's being illustrated to us, we're taking under advisement. Because I just don't want to rankle, but I want to bring it along so that there is some cogent sort of understanding about why something might be done or not.
The first thing we have to do, and I think I'd like to ask Corey to do this right away, is we have to apply to the Mass Historic
For
that we're going to make a change to the historic district. Now, I've already spoken to Chris Scully about this.
Okay.
So, because the normal process, I don't know if you guys know, but the process is if you were going to create a new historic district or change the boundaries, like add something to it, the process is Mass Historic has to approve it to see, that the buildings in this are significant enough to create a historic district. They don't it's just not arbitrary. So they would approve it first. Then it goes to the selectmen to approve also. And then you go into the town, not town meeting, but the neighborhood meetings to talk to the community, to tell them what you're doing. And then ultimately it gets approved at town meeting. So that's the process of approval. It's a long process.
Well,
But
just her suggestion of the Candle House as a district,
Well,
right?
yeah.
yes, you can do
Yeah,
that,
that's
right.
just-
And
I mean,
that's certainly
yeah.
easier.
That would be a district.
And what I understood is if you have, even though you might have people in an area that you're proposing who are opposed to it, that doesn't necessarily stop it.
Correct.
The only reason it could stop it is if they lobby enough town meeting members
Yeah.
to vote against you.
Correct.
But if you have town selectmen support, that's very helpful.
Well, I think that's why, thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Sarah.
Chloe.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, why it's so important to do this in this sort of measured and,
Yes.
comprehensive and analytic way.
Yeah.
So it's not arbitrary in any shape
And
or
it's
form.
no surprise.
But as I say, again, we understand what the shortcomings are of what we have now and what we have to deal with, so that we do see that there might be benefits in smoothing out those edges.
Well, we'll write a script
Yeah.
of all that too, but Corey, oh, sorry. Now, like I said, I spoke to Chris Scully about this already. Chris Scully's part of Mass Historic, and
Yeah.
he would approve it. I explained to him what we were doing.
Yeah.
So we're not changing we are changing the boundaries, but we're not changing the
We may
boundaries.
change the boundaries.
Well, we're not adding properties to
We're
it.
not adding properties.
Right?
We're
If
not-
it's in, it's in. That's the change, right?
Right.
Yeah.
If it's
Rather
in, it's
than the
in.
setback.
So I
Yeah,
spoke
yeah,
to
yeah.
Chris about this, and after I explained to him,
Uh-huh.
he said, gee, that sounds like it would be okay.
Uh-huh.
But I'd like to formally get that approval as the first step, because we have to get Mass Historic first. So I'd like us to start the process by getting their formal approval that what we're doing is okay. Because that's the first step. So let's start the easy steps, the doable steps,
Sure.
And I think that's the first step, is saying, this is what we're doing, we're not changing the properties, we're just redefining the boundaries of the existing historic district is really what we're doing. And so
Or
I'd
that's
like
what we think we're going to end
yeah,
up doing.
I think that's what we're gonna do. I mean, we may do some single ones like
Yeah,
the stone,
yeah.
this Candle House,
Yeah.
but that's the
That's
first
not the
step.
first step. The first step is to change the way
Existing.
we
Right, the way we view it.
interpret it.
But
So-
also with regard to what Sarah said, it's also important, the other project that we're doing with, the CPC grant of getting more of those forms,
Yes,
so that we have the accurate
you have more information, that helps us,
from the macros, and
That
Macros
helps
has
us,
more information.
So could we do that, Corey, get this, there must be a form, where you have to apply for changing historic district or creating a historic district.
Boundary.
So like I said, I explained all of it to them. He said, oh, that should be fine. And at first he was skeptical, but when he understood what I was talking about, he said, oh, you're not really changing your district. You're not creating a district, you're just redefining it. He said, I don't see any problem with that. But let's get it formally. Let's get it formally. Yeah, let's get it formally. So we said, okay, that's done. We have a check mark here. And then we
one.
can start talking about
Step
then the
two.
next steps after that, okay? So that's all I wanted to talk about on that part tonight.
Great.
We'll do that a special time.
Yeah, I think that's something we've been talking about for a
Anyway.
while, and it's nice to go to the next step.
It's nice to get started, okay?
It'd be nice to-
The other thing that I had on here, we had 2 requests for letters of support that came into us, asking us to support their projects. These are 2 organizations that are asking for foundation grants from different organizations, and that have to do with historic issues, and they've asked us for a letter of support, and I think it's reasonable. The first was from the Museum on the Green. They're looking to the Mass Humanities for a grant to produce a short video on Falmouth history that they're using as an educational tool, probably to show in their facility. They could give it to the library, they could put it in the schools. I think a 15 or 20-minute video. So they're applying for a grant. They'd like us to write a letter to Mass Humanities saying we support the project, we think it's worthwhile. I mean, I'd like to even ask, could we plug it on our website at some point in time, too? So if everybody's agreeable to that, I'll make a motion that we write a letter of support for Museum on the Green.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That sounds good.
Yeah. The second request came from Peter Townsend, is that?
Bob Moore.
Bob Moore, close.
Not even.
Bob Moore, who is applying to the Fitch Foundation for a fellowship to do further study into and documentation of the history of the dome. You know, and one of his concerns is the people who were involved with the construction of the dome at that time in 1953 are aging, and we're going to lose those people. And he'd like to do some really documented history of their experience, video it, you know, take interviews, that kind of stuff. Because if the dome ultimately does become a property, an ongoing thing, it would be nice to have that record of the beginnings of it. So that's what he's asking for our support for his request for monies for this additional research on the dorm, another one of our historic properties. So I'll make a motion that we write a letter of support for Bob Moore.
Who is Bob Moore? I'm sorry, I missed.
Bob Moore is an architect. Do you know who Jennifer Gaines is? She was head of the Woods Hole Historical Museum for many years. He happens to be her son-in-law, but he's an architect, and he teaches at RISD, Roger Williams, and MIT. And he's done a lot of historic research, and he wants to continue.
Does he live in Woods Hole?
No, but his mother-in-law does, and his wife grew up here.
Thank you.
So,
Deep roots.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
deep
think
roots.
that the opportunity to record that
Document.
history
Yeah.
and retrospective, I think, is really
it's always nice to have that.
valuable information.
Yeah, you know, and I don't know if ultimately they could put it in the library as a,
Right, so if he were able to get this grant, I wonder if he would have any of it done before or during part of our exhibit that we're planning
Oh,
for
that's
next
right, yeah.
May at the library, but it could certainly be made available. So we are working on that historic
presentation.
exhibit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I make a motion that we write a letter of support for Bob Moore for the Fitch Foundation Fellowship.
Second.
All in favor?
Right.
So, I didn't have
Did
any
you have
other.
edits that you were going to send? So I know he
I
sent deadline.
sent it along to Corey. Corey has a draft of a letter that they were very minor, but
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
wording issues, though.
Are you going to send it directly to Bob? Just so I can tell him what's going to happen.
Yeah, you guys haven't really notified me of the process, so I mean,
If we can, do we have a letterhead? Do we have a formal letterhead? We used to.
Yeah.
the historical commission.
Right.
Yeah.
He wants it electronically because his application is electronic.
Okay.
So if you could just forward it to him, and then
They
he
did
can.
have an extension on the deadline, so we just need it by this week,
Okay.
by the end of this week.
Okay.
Just
Good thing we had this meeting.
Yeah, yeah.
It just turned
Well,
out,
it
and he
just
just
came up
asked yesterday.
Just yesterday. I mean, talk about-
Timely request.
Well, you know how people do grant applications.
Now, I
every time.
don't have a format for the Museum on the Green
Letter,
letter, but I
Maybe
think it's
review.
as simple as that. It's just that we support their
application. to
application for a video of Falmouth's history, you know, which we always view as important for educational purposes. That's what it is, it's for educational purposes, that we support
Both of these
their
are.
application.
Both of these are for educational purposes.
Yeah. Okay?
Very similar request.
Okay.
Send them out tomorrow.
Okay.
Thanks.
So the next meeting is Wednesday, November 8th, because Election Day is Tuesday, so don't forget that.
Even though
Show
we
up
don't
here.
even think we have elections going on.
No, but we can't have it anyway. And then the next night is the presentation that we just spoke about,
8th and 9th.
The workshop.
the workshop. Okay? So I think that's all, unless anybody else has anything else that they wanted to discuss.
I'm just looking forward to the charrette, you know, where we can get into it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
hear what
Get
people have
into
to say.
teams and,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and start focusing. They're a lot of fun. A lot of good stuff comes
It's
out of this.
unfortunate the colors
Yeah.
don't translate, you know, because,
So well, but
It's
they.
much
they-
better on
on the
screen.
paper.
I was looking on the screen and
Yeah.
it's much better.
Yeah.
of the computer.
Yes,
Oh,
the
yeah,
computer,
but
it
up
was
here
very
they-
different than up on the projector. So I think
Yeah.
online,
Uh-huh.
they'll be
People will be
much
able to
more
see it.
legible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's important in getting that out.
Yeah, because they
Um,
miss the impact of it.
And also, this is the first opportunity that we've had to have this kind of public workshop, so I think
Yeah.
that's also really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay then, so I make a motion that we adjourn our meeting. Have a second?
Second?
Adjourn the meeting?
Wonderful.